On October 14th, 1854, a team of surveyors entered the grounds of a plantation in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. Their instructions were procedural: prepare the estate for tax seizure, as no member of the owning family had paid levies in more than 3 years. Yet what they discovered would not resemble the routine repossession of an abandoned property. It would instead uncover one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in antebellum history. The mansion was intact. Its colonnaded façade stood firm against the autumn air, its windows unbroken, its doors still locked from within. The surveyors noted that it did not look pillaged or even weathered, as so many rural estates had become in the difficult years preceding the Civil War. Inside they found a dining table set with porcelain plates, cutlery laid neatly beside them, as though dinner had been interrupted only hours before. In upstairs chambers, beds were made, clothing folded at the footboards. A library smelled of leather and dust, books arranged alphabetically on oak shelves. But there were no people. The enslaved quarters had been stripped of life. Their occupants either sold, escaped, or vanished. The family itself, descendants of French Creole aristocracy, was gone. Not a servant, not a child, not even the patriarch whose name had appeared so prominently in parish registries, remained to greet the officials. At first the men suspected a sudden flight. Yellow fever epidemics had swept through Louisiana in the 1830s and again in the early 1850s. Perhaps the family had abandoned the estate in terror. But then one of the surveyors noticed a section of paneling in the cellar wall, hinged on a concealed frame. Behind it lay a passage of stone and soil, reinforced with timbers descending into the earth. By lantern light they explored the first corridor, expecting perhaps a root cellar or wine vault. Instead, the passage widened into chambers large enough for habitation. Crude bunks were carved against the walls, buckets of dried foodstuffs stood stacked in corners, and air shafts had been driven upward to the fields above, disguised by overgrown cane and brush. The tunnels extended in all directions, branching, folding, and doubling back, forming what the men would describe as a labyrinth beneath the plantation. Their report, filed weeks later in the parish courthouse, attempted to render the experience in bureaucratic language. Yet one sentence betrayed the horror of that moment. The house was deserted, but the earth itself seemed inhabited. The implication was unavoidable. The family had not left the plantation. They had chosen to remove themselves beneath it. This was not an act of flight, but of burial, an aristocratic dynasty deliberately entombing itself alive. Whispers spread quickly. Freedmen and tenant farmers refused to work the grounds, claiming to hear voices through the old vent shafts at night. Priests and pastors speculated about heresy, warning that no Christian family would willingly forsake God's light. Physicians wondered whether paranoia, tuberculosis, or simple madness had driven them into the ground. Neighbors spoke of shame. Perhaps some scandal of incest or degeneracy had led them to disappear rather than face exposure. Whatever the truth, no member of the family was ever seen above ground again. Today, this story survives in fragments: parish ledgers, a Jesuit's correspondence, journals left behind in the mansion, and the testimony of surveyors who walked those tunnels with lanterns that October evening. These pieces confirm the central fact. In 1854, an elite Louisiana family abandoned their mansion and chose instead to dwell entirely underground. This was not a case of poverty, nor of ignorance. It was the decision of one of the wealthiest dynasties in the parish, people educated in Europe, married into nobility, and proud of their lineage, and yet driven by fear of contagion, by obsession with blood purity, and by the corrosive isolation of power, they turned away from the world and dug themselves into the soil. Before we begin this investigation in full, tracing the family's descent from prominence to self-exile, a brief request. These stories stretch across centuries and borders, but their memory depends on us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether Louisiana itself, another part of the United States, or from farther afield. Your presence here, your connection to this story, helps preserve its lessons, reminding us that what happened in St. Landry Parish was not inevitable, but the result of choices, fears, and failures that can be studied, remembered, and perhaps prevented elsewhere. This is the opening of the Hollow Plantation case, an empty house above, and beneath it, a family who chose to vanish into darkness. The plantation stood on the western edge of St. Landry Parish, near the Bayou Teche, a region once dominated by sugarcane and cotton. In the mid-19th century, this landscape represented the height of Creole wealth. Families of French and Spanish descent, some of whom traced their ancestry to colonial officers or European nobility, controlled vast acreages along the bayous. Their estates were built not merely as homes, but as statements: Greek Revival façades, sweeping verandas, libraries filled with imported books, and dining rooms lit by French chandeliers. The family at the heart of our case belonged to this world. Parish records identify them as landholders since at least 1803, when Louisiana passed from French to American control. Their patriarch, a man educated in Paris and New Orleans, had inherited both land and an obsession with maintaining lineage. Surviving letters describe his insistence that marriages occur within their circle, meaning unions with cousins or with other Creole elites of the parish. The blood must remain unclouded, he wrote in an 1829 letter preserved in diocesan archives. Their mansion, completed in 1832, was considered among the most refined in the region. Visitors described a front lawn shaded by live oaks, a reflecting pool stocked with lilies, and an avenue of cane stretching to the river. Yet alongside this beauty, contemporaries noted a peculiar reserve. Unlike other planters, who attended Mardi Gras balls in New Orleans or served in parish offices, this family seldom appeared in public life. They were present in records, but absent in society. The 1830s and 1840s tested all of Louisiana. Waves of cholera and yellow fever swept through the Mississippi Valley, killing tens of thousands. In some parishes, mortality among children reached catastrophic levels. Physicians, working without modern germ theory, prescribed isolation, purging, and even the avoidance of sunlight as remedies. For a family already inclined towards secrecy and blood purity, these epidemics reinforced a suspicion of the outside world. One surviving physician's account, written in 1837, describes the patriarch as anxious to the point of mania, requesting barriers between his children and the air of the town. By the 1850s, their isolation had deepened. Parish registers show diminishing attendance at church, and there are no records of marriage outside their own kin group after 1848. A Jesuit missionary, visiting the estate in 1852, recorded in his journal, "They refuse sacraments, saying the soil itself provides sanctuary. The father speaks of the air as poisoned, of the sun as a burning contagion. They are polite, yet closed to persuasion." His account is one of the last verified interactions with the family before they vanished from the surface. Geographically, the estate's position allowed for concealment. The soil near Bayou Teche is soft alluvium, easily cut for irrigation canals and cisterns. Enslaved, laborers had long been tasked with digging trenches for drainage. Extending these into living spaces would not have been technically impossible. Oral traditions from descendants of the enslaved community suggest that workers were ordered to dig cellars that had no end. When questioned, they were told it was for wine storage. In reality, it was the foundation of the labyrinth that would later consume the family itself. The family's wealth insulated them from scrutiny. Even as they withdrew, their land produced enough sugar to satisfy creditors. Agents sold crops on their behalf, so long as shipments were delivered to the docks. This allowed the family to remain invisible, yet financially viable. Only when production collapsed in 1851, coinciding with the disappearance of enslaved labor from the estate, did debts accumulate, prompting the parish court to initiate repossession. Thus, when the surveyors arrived in 1854, they did not expect mystery. They expected a routine confiscation of property from a reclusive, indebted family. Instead, they encountered silence above ground and evidence of habitation below. To understand how a respected dynasty could come to such an end, we must trace the intersection of geography, disease, and ideology. Louisiana's fertile soil allowed them to build wealth. Louisiana's epidemics drove them into fear, and Louisiana's insular Creole society encouraged endogamous practices that narrowed their social and genetic circle. By 1854, these forces converged into one decision: to abandon the surface world entirely. The context matters because it shows this was not the madness of a single man, nor the sudden collapse of a household. It was the culmination of decades of retreat, fueled by cultural pressures, medical ignorance, and the fragile illusion of purity. A family whose name once commanded respect in parish halls came to believe that survival required burial, and dignity could be preserved only underground. This is the world in which the Hollow Plantation case began. Bayous rich with cane, mansions filled with wealth, and yet beneath them darkness waiting. The first descent into the tunnels occurred late in the afternoon of October 14th, 1854. The surveyors, 5 in total, had already catalogued the mansion's interior when one of them noticed the irregular paneling in the cellar. A thin line in the plaster betrayed a hidden seam. With pressure, the wall shifted inward, revealing a darkness that no lantern could fully penetrate. At first the men hesitated. Louisiana's soil was known to collapse, and they feared it might be nothing more than an abandoned cistern. But when they entered, the passage proved stable, its walls braced by timbers, its floor packed with clay. The men advanced cautiously, lanterns raised. What began as a narrow corridor soon opened into chambers, spaces not accidental, but planned. The first chamber measured 20 feet across. Along its edges were bunks carved from cypress, lined with rotting bedding. The air was heavy, close, but not without circulation. Narrow shafts cut into the ceiling drew faint currents upward. On one wall, hooks held lanterns, their wicks burned down to stubs. In another corner, a pile of firewood suggested recent use. As they pressed deeper, they found barrels of rice and cornmeal, sacks of beans, jars sealed with wax, stores prepared for long habitation. One barrel bore the date 1851, written in chalk. The implication was inescapable. For at least 3 years, the family had been living beneath their own plantation. The tunnels extended farther than the men dared to follow. Some branched sharply, others doubled back in confusion. One descended it at an angle, its floor damp with seepage, leading toward a chamber where crude benches circled a stone altar. It was here that one surveyor claimed to see traces of writing on the wall, scratches resembling Latin prayers, though none could be deciphered clearly. Another chamber contained child-sized bunks, no larger than cradles, suggesting that infants or young children had once been housed there. The psychological weight of the place grew unbearable. The surveyors later testified that the silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water from overhead. Each man carried the uneasy sense of being observed, though no one else was present. When one lantern flickered, another swore he heard a cough echo faintly through the shafts. Whether memory or imagination, such accounts spread quickly, magnifying the mystery. When they emerged back into daylight, their report was hurried, almost reluctant. They recorded the existence of tunnels, extensive beyond estimation, evidence of habitation, recent but now abandoned, and stores sufficient for years. Yet even in official language, their unease was visible. The men insisted that further exploration required more people, perhaps even soldiers, before the network could be mapped safely. Word leaked within days. Farm hands on neighboring properties refused to approach the land, claiming the surveyors had awakened something that ought to have been left undisturbed. Freedmen who had once labored there told stories of hearing voices through the earth at night, whispers rising through concealed vents. One recalled seeing smoke drift from a cane field, even when no one appeared above ground, a detail now given sinister weight. The local press, limited to weekly sheets, reported only cautiously. An October 21st edition of the Opelousas Courier noted that an unusual subterranean structure had been found on an abandoned estate, but omitted names. Privately, editors worried about provoking panic or scandal among the parish's elite. Still, gossip spread faster than print. At church, parishioners whispered that the family had given themselves to heretical practices. In taverns, men speculated about incest, plague, or even cannibalism. Among clergy, reactions were mixed. Some insisted it was a retreat born of fear, cholera, yellow fever, and God's wrath driving the family to shield themselves underground. Others framed it as defiance, a refusal to accept divine providence. A Jesuit letter from November 1854 describes the tunnels as catacombs of the living, fashioned not for worship, but for escape from grace. The official investigation stalled. With the Civil War approaching, resources were scarce, and few had the appetite to untangle a mystery that seemed, in some sense, already concluded. The family was gone, their property seized. The tunnels were left unexplored, their full extent unknown. Yet in community memory, the discovery grew with each retelling. Children dared one another to approach the estate at night. Farmers called it La Maison Creuse, the hollow house. For the surveyors themselves, the memory lingered as something darker. One, years later, described the experience to his grandson as walking through graves before the bodies were laid in them. Another kept a piece of the paneling from the cellar as proof, though he refused to speak of what he had seen underground. The first discovery was not merely physical, it was psychological. It revealed that wealth, refinement, and lineage could collapse into something unrecognizable when fear overruled reason. What the men encountered beneath the mansion was not ruin, but preparation, a deliberate, organized descent into darkness. This discovery marked the turning point. From here, the story would shift from curiosity to investigation, as physicians, priests, and neighbors sought to understand what drove a family to abandon the surface world. The question that haunted both parish officials and later historians was simple. What did underground living do to the family itself? The tunnels revealed intention and structure, but they did not explain the condition of those who inhabited them. For that, we turned to fragments, medical records, testimonies of local physicians, and journals left behind in the mansion above. Together they paint a portrait of decline, both physical and social, that accompanied the family's withdrawal into the earth. In 1837, a cholera epidemic swept through Louisiana, killing thousands along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Parish death registers list 3 servants of the estate as victims. That same year, the family's patriarch summoned Dr. Etienne Rousseau, a physician trained in Paris, to examine his children. Rousseau's surviving notes, preserved in a folio donated to the Louisiana Historical Society, describe paleness of the skin, frequent coughs, and general weakness of constitution. He advised greater exposure to sunlight, a prescription that the patriarch dismissed. Instead, Rousseau was dismissed from service, his recommendations ignored. By the 1840s, local gossip noted the family's unusual appearance. Neighbors described their children as thin, with eyes that watered in daylight. One woman interviewed decades later recalled that they walked in the evening like ghosts, covered in veils, as though the sun itself burned them. These accounts, though anecdotal, align with conditions now understood as rickets and vitamin D deficiency, ailments directly linked to lack of sunlight. The journals recovered from the mansion provide further evidence. In one, believed to be written by the eldest daughter around 1850, she laments, "The air outside burns my throat. Father says it is poison. We must stay close to the earth. He says the earth protects us." Another entry notes the use of whale oil lamps and a regimen of boiled milk and beans, meals heavy in starch but poor in nutrients. By modern standards, such a diet, combined with subterranean confinement, would have worsened both bone fragility and immune weakness. Medical decline was compounded by social practices. Parish marriage registers reveal that after 1848, no member of the family married outside their kin. A cousin from New Orleans was brought to the estate in 1851, but subsequent records suggest she never returned. Oral tradition holds that she resisted the subterranean experiment and was sent away in disgrace. Within 2 years, marriages occurred exclusively between first cousins, a fact corroborated by baptismal entries noting consanguinity dispensed by clerical authority. The effects of endogamy were visible in subsequent generations. One child, described in Rousseau's earlier notes, was born with polydactyly, 6 fingers on each hand. Another, according to midwife testimony, did not survive infancy due to a defect of the chest and breath. While tragic in any context, these outcomes were consistent with recessive genetic conditions exacerbated by close intermarriage. Social withdrawal amplified physical frailty. Without regular visits to town or church, the family ceased vaccination during a period when smallpox remained endemic. Without priests, their sacraments were performed privately, often by the patriarch himself, who proclaimed that God hears us more clearly beneath his earth. Without schoolmasters, children were educated only in scripture and the writings of their ancestors. By the time the tunnels were constructed in the early 1850s, the family was already a closed system, genetically, socially, and ideologically sealed off. One of the most chilling documents, a fragment of a physician's correspondence from 1852, records an urgent call to the plantation. Dr. Pierre Lemaire was summoned to treat a young boy who could not see in daylight and stumbled as though blind. His account notes that the boy's skin was as pale as wax and that he perspired profusely in sunlight. He suspected congenital cataracts or severe photophobia, both conditions associated with inherited disorders. When Lemaire recommended treatment in New Orleans, the family refused. Within days he was dismissed, and no further records of the boy survive. By the time the surveyors entered the estate in 1854, they found journals that suggested the family had fully embraced their subterranean life. One entry, unsigned but dated February 1853, declared, "We are of the soil. The air above is death, but the earth is womb. Those who remain faithful shall be preserved." Scholars have interpreted this as evidence of a worldview in which burial and life had become interchangeable concepts. The family saw themselves as already entombed, yet still living. Medical historians reviewing the case in the 20th century identified a cluster of probable diagnoses: rickets, congenital malformations from consanguinity, and respiratory illnesses worsened by damp, enclosed air. In the absence of sunlight, their bodies weakened. In the absence of genetic diversity, their offspring suffered defects. In the absence of social contact, their beliefs calcified into doctrine. The result was not merely physical decline, but the collapse of any bridge to the outside world. What makes these anomalies haunting is not that they occurred in isolation, but that they were chosen. This was not a community cut off by geography, like settlers stranded in mountain hollows. This was a family surrounded by fertile land, trade routes, and neighbors, yet who deliberately closed themselves beneath the soil. Their anomalies were not accidents of nature, but the product of willful confinement. Thus, when later generations would speak of the hollow plantation, they did so not only in whispers of tunnels, but in recollections of pale children, of eyes that recoiled from the sun, and of a family whose very bodies bore the marks of their retreat from the world. As the family withdrew deeper into their subterranean refuge, their hostility toward outside contact became more pronounced. What began as eccentricity hardened into rule, enforced with secrecy, threats, and, according to some accounts, violence. Enslaved men and women, who for decades had maintained the cane fields, were among the first to notice the change. Oral traditions preserved in the Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s recall whispered warnings passed among workers. "Don't walk near the old cistern fields. They hear you from below." One elder, identified only as Louis B., claimed that laborers were ordered to dig endless trenches in the early 1850s, believing they were for drainage. Only later did they realize these channels became air shafts for the underground chambers. When some questioned the purpose, they were sold away within months, removed from the parish entirely. This practice, repeated with others who showed curiosity, created a climate of fear that discouraged inquiry. Priests, too, met resistance. A Jesuit missionary, Father Antoine Marchand, recorded a visit in 1852 during which the patriarch refused communion. He said the air of the church was corrupted by the breath of strangers. Marchand wrote in his diary, "He insists their sacraments are performed in the soil, where purity remains." Marchand attempted to return months later, but was barred from the property entirely. Local clergy, balancing fragile relations with powerful landowners, did not press the issue further. By 1853, the family ceased attending parish masses altogether. Baptismal records list only private ceremonies, dispensations granted, often performed within the estate itself. Neighbors remarked on the absence of their carriages from the Sunday procession. For a Catholic Creole family, this was not merely social withdrawal, but spiritual severance. To live without sacraments was, in the eyes of the community, to live outside grace. Secular officials fared no better. When tax collectors arrived in early 1853, they were greeted not by the family, but by agents who delivered coin at the gate. Requests to inspect the property were ignored. By late that year, even payments ceased. prompting the repossession order of 1854. Some speculated that the family assumed their wealth would shield them indefinitely. Others believed they no longer considered themselves bound by civil law, answering only to their patriarch and his doctrine of soil and blood. Testimonies from neighboring farmers add another layer. One recalled seeing smoke rise from the cane fields without a hand in sight. Another described hearing a child's cry carried on the wind, yet finding no one when he followed the sound. Whether these were products of imagination, misperception, or truth distorted by rumor, they reinforced a conviction. Something was alive beneath the earth, and it wished not to be disturbed. Even enslaved laborers who escaped, the estate carried with them stories of restriction. One woman, interviewed in New Orleans after her flight in 1852, reported that she was forbidden from entering certain fields near the house. They said the master's family was resting there, resting in the ground, she explained. Another, questioned by an abolitionist newspaper, recalled being warned never to look toward the back of the house at night. Lanterns moved where there was no one above, he said. The pattern was unmistakable. Outsiders were excluded, insiders silenced, and those who resisted removed. In this way, the family maintained its subterranean experiment without exposure, even as rumors spread. By the time the surveyors entered in 1854, the parish had already grown accustomed to their absence, treating the estate as a place apart, strange but untouchable. Resistance was not only practical but ideological. Surviving journals contain explicit instructions forbidding contact. One page, written in 1852 by the patriarch himself, declares, "Let no stranger's breath enter our dwelling. The soil alone sustains us. Those who seek to intrude bring corruption, and their voices shall not be heard." Such language indicates that exclusion was not incidental, but doctrinal, a principle passed down and enforced within the household. Medical aid was perhaps the most tragically resisted. As conditions worsened underground, with children showing deformities and illnesses, physicians who attempted to intervene were turned away. One doctor later wrote in frustration, "They prefer to sicken in silence than to heal in daylight." His account was echoed by others who suspected that shame, pride, and fear of exposure outweighed any desire for treatment. This absolute rejection of outside contact completed the family's transformation. They were no longer planters participating reluctantly in parish society. They had become a closed community, governed by their own rules, existing in defiance of both church and state. Resistance to outsiders was not a symptom. It was their survival strategy. Yet in resisting others, they resisted the very lifelines that could have preserved them: medicine, faith, law, and human connection. Cut off from all of these, the family sealed itself not only beneath the earth, but within a logic that allowed no return. To understand why a family of wealth and education would abandon the surface world, we must look beyond the material tunnels into the psychological labyrinth that guided them. Their decision was not sudden, nor purely practical. It was the culmination of decades of fear, theology warped into doctrine, and generations taught to see daylight as danger. The patriarch who presided over this transformation, identified in parish documents as Jean-Baptiste L., had been born in 1796, educated in Paris during his youth. He returned to Louisiana imbued with Enlightenment learning, but also with a fervent belief in preserving family purity. Letters to his brother in France describe disdain for American manners and mingling of races, sentiments consistent with Creole aristocracy, but carried to an extreme. By the 1830s, after successive epidemics of cholera and yellow fever devastated the Mississippi Valley. These prejudices hardened into a cosmology. The outside world was corrupt, diseased, and profane. Only the soil beneath his own land remained sanctified. Cholera, in particular, haunted his imagination. The epidemic of 1832 killed an estimated 4,000 in New Orleans within weeks, filling graveyards so rapidly that bodies were interred in common pits. Though medical science of the time had no concept of microbes, physicians spoke of miasma, poisoned air arising from swamps and crowded quarters. For Jean-Baptiste, such theories validated his suspicions. He began forbidding his children from traveling to town during outbreaks, insisting that God has buried the unfaithful in his wrath, and the earth alone shields us. Family journals reveal how these fears became ritualized. One entry by his eldest son in 1841 describes their father ordering windows to be shuttered even in summer heat, declaring that light brings pestilence. Another recalls prayers recited in the cellar each night, invoking not heaven above, but the womb of the earth, which protects its faithful children. The imagery of burial became increasingly central. To be underground was not death, but safety, rebirth, preservation. By the 1850s, this ideology had evolved into full doctrine. Surviving manuscripts, recovered from the mansion library, outline rules for subterranean living. They prescribe limited exposure to the sun, consumption of food sealed from the air, and rejection of contact with outsiders. The patriarch wrote, "We must become as those who sleep in the grave, yet live. In this manner we escape corruption until the earth yields us anew." Scholars analyzing these texts have argued that the family effectively constructed its own theology, blending Catholic ritual with burial imagery, transforming fear of disease into a creed of soil-bound purity. Psychological accounts suggest the children internalized these beliefs deeply. Testimonies from neighboring families describe them recoiling from social interaction, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in whispers when outside. One teacher recalled that a daughter, sent briefly to parish school in 1847, refused to sit near windows and kept her arms wrapped across her chest. Within months, she was withdrawn from classes permanently. Such behavior, seen now through the lens of trauma, indicates children raised to equate exposure with peril. The role of consanguinity further reinforced isolation. As marriages were restricted to cousins, opportunities for external connection narrowed. Family gatherings became insular, echo chambers in which the patriarch's doctrines circulated unchecked. Without spouses from outside, there were no dissenting voices, no alternative interpretations of disease, faith, or community. The lineage folded in on itself, both genetically and ideologically. By the time the tunnels were constructed, likely between 1851 and 1853, the family was prepared, not only logistically but spiritually, to inhabit them. The cholera epidemic of 1850 provided the final catalyst. Parish mortality spiked, and newspapers reported mass graves along the bayous. For Jean-Baptiste, this was proof of divine punishment. In a journal entry dated August 1850, he wrote, "They are consumed by the air. We alone shall survive, for we have chosen the soil." Construction of subterranean chambers followed within months, carried out by enslaved laborers under strict orders. The physical act of digging thus became an enactment of belief. Each chamber reinforced the idea that safety lay below, not above. Each air shaft, disguised in the fields, became both a lifeline and a wall of separation. For the patriarch, the tunnels were not exile, they were salvation. Later generations would interpret this doctrine as a form of collective psychosis, an entire family system oriented toward fear. Yet it is important to note the systemic failures that allowed it. Clergy granted dispensations for consanguineous marriages rather than intervening. Physicians, dismissed when their advice was unwelcome, had no authority to compel treatment. Parish officials, wary of confronting wealthy landowners, allowed tax delinquency to fester until abandonment was unavoidable. Each institution failed to challenge the family's dissent, enabling ideology to become reality. Thus, when we speak of the hollow plantation, we are not speaking only of tunnels and pale children. We are speaking of a worldview that transformed soil into sanctuary, burial into life, and fear into inheritance. The family did not simply hide underground. They believed themselves consecrated there. In the end, what destroyed them was not disease from without, but the doctrine within, a theology of fear passed from father to child, generation after generation, until no one remained willing to step back into the light. When the tunnels were first documented, in 1854, parish officials treated the case not as a humanitarian emergency, but as a matter of property. The estate had failed to meet tax obligations for 3 consecutive years. By statute, it could be seized, inventoried, and resold at auction. The report of the surveyors, chilling as it was entered into court records as evidence of abandonment, not tragedy. In bureaucratic terms, the family was simply gone. The parish court issued a formal notice of repossession in December of that year. It described the plantation house, the cane fields, and the subterranean structures of indeterminate extent as part of the property to be sold. Nowhere did the record speculate on the fate of the inhabitants. The law had no category for a family that had deliberately buried itself alive. In early 1855, probate proceedings began. Creditors, including New Orleans merchants who had extended loans against sugar shipments, appeared to claim debts. Their testimony provides rare glimpses into the family's final years. One merchant recalled receiving payments through intermediaries, but never seeing a member of the family in person after 1851. Another admitted that shipments had ceased entirely by 1853, suggesting the family had already retreated fully underground by that time. During probate, officials authorized a second inspection of the tunnels. This time, a larger party descended, including a sheriff's deputy and 2 parish clerks. Their account, preserved in the court archives, confirms the presence of human remains. In one chamber, they found skeletal fragments arranged on bedding, as though occupants had died in their bunks. In another, a child's skull lay beside a small cot. The report avoids speculation, but its language is stark. The chambers contain evidence of habitation and of mortality. No living persons were encountered. The discovery of remains raised uncomfortable questions. Were these deaths the result of illness, starvation, or deliberate entombment? Did the family perish together, or did some survive longer, perhaps escaping unnoticed? The court did not pursue answers. Instead, the presence of remains was recorded only as an obstacle to sale. Prospective buyers balked at purchasing land described as tainted by subterranean graves. As a result, the property languished unsold for years, passing eventually into state custody. Church authorities faced a similar dilemma. Burials on consecrated ground were required for Catholic faithful, yet here were bodies interred in chambers beneath a house, outside the blessing of cemetery or priest. The diocesan archives include a terse note from 1856. Family of L. presumed deceased. Burials irregular. No further action. With this, the Church effectively abandoned the matter, unwilling to confront the theological scandal of parishioners who had rejected the sacraments of the surface world. The state of Louisiana, embroiled in sectional politics and later the Civil War, paid little attention. Records from Baton Rouge mention the estate only in relation to tax revenue. No investigation into the welfare of possible survivors was ever launched. The enslaved workers, whose testimonies could have illuminated events, had already dispersed through sale, escape, or manumission, their voices largely lost to history. In retrospect, the institutional response reveals a pattern of avoidance. Each authority, the parish court, the church, the state, chose silence over confrontation. To acknowledge the full truth would have required admitting that a respected Creole family had collapsed into madness beneath their own estate, that endogamy, fear, and isolation had produced not continuity, but annihilation. Instead, officials treated it as an administrative inconvenience, property to be catalogued, debts to be settled, graves to be ignored. It was not until decades later, during Reconstruction, that oral accounts from freedmen brought renewed attention. Some reported that tunnels remained partially open, that bones still lay visible in the soil. Others insisted that descendants had survived, continuing to dwell in hidden chambers. Parish authorities, unwilling to fund excavation, allowed the land to revert to wild cane and oak. The case faded into folklore, remembered more in whispers than in law. This institutional neglect underscores a broader failure. Louisiana in the mid-19th century was a society riven by class, race, and disease. Institutions that might have intervened, medical, legal, clerical, chose instead to defer to wealth, to custom, or to indifference. In doing so, they allowed an entire family to vanish underground, unchallenged and unmourned, until only bones remained. Thus the legal and institutional response to the Hollow Plantation was not decisive action, but bureaucratic retreat. The family's fate was sealed not only by their own doctrines, but by a society unwilling to confront what their disappearance represented, the collapse of an elite lineage into self-burial, aided by silence from those who should have spoken. When the probate court closed its files in 1856, the Hollow Plantation ceased to exist in law. The land reverted to the parish, later passing into state custody and eventually into the hands of speculative buyers. Yet in community memory, it never disappeared. The house, the tunnels, and the remains left below lingered like an open wound. For decades afterward, the estate was treated not as a property, but as a place to be avoided. Freedmen who had once labored in its cane fields refused to return, even as tenant contracts offered land nearby. An oral history collected in 1892 records one man's words, "That ground is not for the living." They say the family sleeps still below, waiting. Others claimed that crops planted too near the tunnel shafts failed to thrive, as though the soil itself resisted cultivation. Whether superstition or coincidence, such accounts discouraged resettlement. By the 1870s, the plantation house itself had begun to collapse. Its shutters fell, its roof caved under storms, and vines climbed over its veranda. Travelers on the Bayou Teche reported seeing the silhouette of the ruin at dusk, a black mass against the horizon. Children dared one another to run across the property at night, whispering that pale figures would emerge from the shafts to chase trespassers. Hunters told stories of hearing footsteps underground, hollow echoes that followed them through the fields. Folklore flourished. Some said the family had made a pact with the earth, exchanging daylight for immortality. Others claimed that descendants still lived below, their eyes blind, their skin white as bone, feeding on roots and insects in silence. In Creole communities, the estate was sometimes called La Maison Creuse, the Hollow House, or La Tombe des Vivants. the tomb of the living. These names carried both horror and fascination, reminders that wealth could not shield one from decay when fear became creed. Community reactions reveal more than superstition. They reveal a reckoning. The hollow plantation became a symbol of hubris, a warning that pride and isolation could consume even the most privileged. Among freedmen, the story carried an additional layer. It was remembered as a house where bondage had been doubled, not only for the enslaved, but for the masters themselves, who chose to chain their own lives beneath the soil. They were captives of their own fear. One man recalled, "We were captives of theirs." The site also shaped parish identity. For years, it was cited in sermons as a cautionary tale. Pastors warned congregations against abandoning God's light, drawing parallels between the underground family and biblical stories of those who turned from grace. Teachers in rural schools told students to beware of isolation, using the plantation as an allegory for pride that became self-destruction. Even newspapers, though rarely naming the family directly, invoked the hollow plantation in editorials about epidemic fear, warning readers not to retreat from society in times of crisis. In the decades after the Civil War, as Louisiana struggled through Reconstruction, the story took on new resonance. The plantation became a symbol of a fallen order, a house of masters reduced to ruin, their wealth and lineage buried with them. Tenant farmers spoke of it as a place where the old world went to ground and never rose again. In this way, memory of the hollow plantation became intertwined with memory of slavery itself, both systems collapsing under their own contradictions, both leaving scars on the land. By the early 20th century, the site had largely returned to wilderness. The house crumbled entirely, its timbers carted away by scavengers. The tunnels, unmaintained, caved in under decades of floods and storms. Yet memory persisted in oral tradition, passed down in families who lived nearby. In some versions, the story became embellished with Gothic imagery of ghosts, curses, and subterranean creatures. But at its core, the essential truth remained. A family once wealthy and proud had abandoned daylight, and in doing so, had erased itself. What is striking is the durability of the tale. Even without formal memorials or historical markers, the hollow plantation lived on in the speech of ordinary people. Farmers warned children not to wander too near. Fishermen swore they saw lights flickering where no houses stood. And genealogists, searching parish records, occasionally stumbled across the abrupt end of a prominent name line, recorded only as extinct. The aftermath, then, was not only physical abandonment, but cultural transformation. The estate ceased to be a farm and became a story told to instill caution, to explain ruins, to reckon with fear. In this way, the hollow plantation did not disappear. It survived in memory, not as a home, but as a warning carved into the folklore of Louisiana. More than a century and a half has passed since the family of the hollow plantation abandoned the light of day. Their mansion has vanished, their tunnels collapsed, and their names largely erased from parish registers. Yet their story endures, not because of their wealth, but because of what their fate reveals about human fear, institutional failure, and the dangers of isolation. The immediate legacy is silence. Parish records close with the words, "line extinct." Church registers mention only irregular burials. The state files list the land as abandoned, later resold without reference to what once stood there. The family that once commanded respect in St. Landry Parish left no heirs, no monuments, no graves under the blessing of stone crosses. Their memory survives only in fragments, a physician's notes, a Jesuit's journal, the report of surveyors who stumbled through tunnels by lantern light. But silence is not the same as absence. The hollow plantation lives on as a parable, retold through generations of Louisianans. It warns of what happens when wealth becomes insularity, when fear becomes doctrine, and when institutions choose convenience over intervention. It reminds us that decline is not always sudden, nor violent. Sometimes it is a slow retreat, window shutters closed, doors locked, walls thickened, until nothing remains but the echo of footsteps underground. Medical historians view the case as an illustration of how isolation magnifies genetic and physical decline. The family's insistence on endogamy, coupled with their refusal of medical aid, produced children whose bodies bore the marks of that confinement. Their pale skin, fragile bones, and failing eyes were not random anomalies, but predictable outcomes of choices reinforced over generations. In this, the hollow plantation stands alongside other isolated communities, Appalachian hollows, Ozark cabins, where secrecy and stigma allowed similar patterns to repeat. Social historians interpret the case as a failure of institutions. Clergy granted dispensations rather than challenging incestuous unions. Physicians were dismissed when their advice proved inconvenient. Parish officials prioritized tax revenue over human welfare. Each authority deferred to wealth and custom until nothing remained to prevent catastrophe. The hollow plantation was not merely the product of one family's fear. It was the product of a society unwilling to confront its privileged members, even as they destroyed themselves. For descendants of enslaved people who once labored on the estate, the story carries a different meaning. Oral traditions frame the hollow plantation as a place where bondage doubled back upon itself. Masters who sought to control the bodies of others became prisoners of their own doctrine, entombed by the very soil they believed would preserve them. They chained themselves, one freedman's grandson recalled. They didn't need us to do it. In this interpretation, the hollow plantation is less a tragedy than a reckoning, the collapse of an elite family under the weight of its own cruelty and fear. Today, the site is gone. The bayou has reclaimed its fields, and the tunnels lie collapsed beneath layers of silt and oak. Yet the lesson remains urgent. Fear of contagion, obsession with purity, and mistrust of outsiders are not relics of the 19th century. They are patterns that resurface whenever societies fracture, whenever communities choose isolation over solidarity. The hollow plantation reminds us that walls built to keep danger out can just as easily become tombs that keep life in. As we close this case, let us return to the surveyor's words in 1854. The house was deserted, but the earth itself seemed inhabited. He meant it as description, but it reads now as epitaph. The family sought safety beneath the soil, but found only erasure. Their wealth, their lineage, their pride, all dissolved into silence. Their story remains, however, for us to remember. It is not a tale of monsters or ghosts, but of human choices, choices shaped by fear, sustained by silence, and sealed beneath the ground. To study it is to remind ourselves of the cost of retreat, and of the necessity of vigilance in medicine, in law, in community, so that no family, however powerful, is left to vanish into darkness again. And so, as always, we leave you with reflection. The hollow plantation is not only Louisiana's story, it is a warning that spans generations and geographies. As you listen now, consider where you are watching from, whether near the bayous of the South or far across oceans. Your place in this conversation matters. Share it with us in the comments below. In remembering together, we resist the silence that once buried this family. In speaking, we keep their story in the light.